It is so lovely to see all of your beautiful faces. Welcome to Opening Doors. My name is Jake Stapanski. I am the program manager for adult programs at Central Synagogue and a huge Sondheim fan. This is the third program in our Summer of Sondheim series, celebrating the life and legacy of the great Stephen Sondheim. I am thrilled you are here. It has been a delight curating this season. When I was in 8th grade, I was in a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, and the director took me under his wing. And one day, as he was driving me home from one of the rehearsals, he was like, "Look, I'm about to play some music that is going to change your life. This is the best overture that has ever been written for the theater." And he pressed play on the Merrily We Roll Along overture, which you just heard an excerpt from, and it absolutely rocked my world. And so it is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome today's speakers to the stage. Of course, we have the incredible Rabbi Lorge from Central Synagogue, and we have the one and only Abigail Pogrebin, one of our past presidents. She is the author of Stars of David and My Jewish Year, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. She wrote a series for Forward called Still Small Voice, interviewing clergy and scholars about their own faith. She co-hosted a podcast for Tablet Magazine called Parsha in Progress, and she moderates public interviews for the Manhattan JCC, the Stryker Center, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and our own Central Synagogue, and of course has a connection to Stephen Sondheim that you will learn about today. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Jake, and thank you for putting together this incredible series. We also want to thank Theo, who is our technician tonight, and we want to thank all of you for being here, and we want to thank Abby for agreeing to chat with us about this. I admit I am a little nervous to be interviewing Abby, who interviews so many people and is sort of the master of this art. So I hope I do all right.
You already have, Art. It's so nice to have the tables turned.
All right. Well, I'm really excited for this conversation. We have had a lot of conversations throughout the years, but this is not really something I've ever had a chance to.
Mostly Torah.
Mostly Torah, synagogue and things like that. We've talked theater, but I've never really had a chance to hear a whole lot about your experience in an original Broadway cast of a Stephen Sondheim show. This isn't necessarily, is it fair to say, an experience that you wear on your sleeve?
I don't wear this experience on my sleeve. I mean, there's some people in my family who might disagree with that. But no, part of it is that it sort of feels pathetic to bring it up, 40 something years later.
Okay.
But it has come up more and more recently because it keeps getting revived. This show that was such a famous disaster has been, resurrected, I think, pretty incredibly. And we can talk about why more and more recently, including, as you know, it's about to be again with Daniel Radcliffe, and they're making a movie of it with Ben Platt and Beanie Feldstein. So it's kind of keeps coming back. And so our cast, and thank goodness everyone, knock wood, is still living, we keep kind of reuniting, which may be sort of pathetic, but we can talk about that as well later. The endless reunion of the Merrily cast.
Oh, I do want to talk more about that later, but before we dive into all of this and sort of how you stepped into it and why, let's just maybe set the scene for folks who are not Sondheim aficionados. This is, as you said, a show that is famous for not succeeding after an incredible run of Stephen Sondheim's. Sondheim had a lot of early success, but then develops a partnership with Hal Prince, and they kind of go on a decades-long journey of successes that starts in 1970 with Company, 71 with Follies, 73 with Little Night Music, 76 with Pacific Overture, 79 with Sweeney Todd, and then 81 comes Merrily. And this is famously their last collaboration until Bounce. Right. The show, can you give us like a summary for those who don't know about what it's about and some of the themes that run through it?
Yes, I will. And I'm so glad you laid out the track record, because that's part of why the debacle was so shattering. And I'm going to try to explain it really on one foot, as we do say, but this is part of what was wrong with it, or what was, I think, its challenge was that it was hard to understand the story. And basically it's because it went backwards chronologically. The reason why we kids were cast as kids is the idea, the conceit was that you see us when we are at our jaded worst in the first scene, and then it goes backwards in time, I think, 30-ish years until we are at our idealistic beginning, with stars in our eyes and all of our goals and a sense of promise and possibility. And they wanted essentially kids to go from, being those jaded adults to the kind of, fresh-eyed, doughy-eyed, hopeful beginners. And that there was something about seeing in the same person the youth that was, in a sense, lost. What was confusing was that all of us sort of had parts. We all had kind of storylines. So there were a lot of us. And then going backwards is confusing, and you're not exactly sure what year you're in.
Right.
And keeping track of which story mattered, which thread mattered, was confusing. And that was part of when we talk about what they tried to solve as we got closer to opening night and the changes were coming fast and furious. Part of what they did was sort of cut away those of us who had these alternate storylines until it really left the three. And the three that everyone should know are Frank, Mary, and Charlie. Frank and Charlie are collaborators on show writing, music and lyric. And Mary is the writer, who is a magazine writer, aspiring magazine writer. And all of them are kind of at the beginning of their careers together, growing up together and trying to make it in either theater or in fiction or nonfiction in Mary's case.
And this is based off of a work that existed by Kaufman and Hart of the same title, who famously wrote "You Can't Take It With You" and other really famous shows of the 30s.
George Kaufman, yeah.
Yeah. And what can you tell us your Sondheim origin story? Not like when you got into the show, but like what was your first encounter with Sondheim's work? You described kind of falling in love with his work.
Yeah, I was kind of in the bassinet. Like, I don't know, I have a twin sister, Robin, some of you may know, identical twin. And we just had the theater bug from like the minute we came out on the cesarean. I don't know what it was that we just always wanted to sing and dance. We were always, putting on costumes. We had more costumes than we had real clothes. We would like go to flea markets and beg my mom or dad for like another piece of jewelry, another pair of shoes that didn't fit us. We just lived in that world. I know many people did, but particularly my mom got us show tune records. Fiddler on the Roof was the first show we ever saw. I think I was 5 years old, might have been 6. Mom, I think, is on the Zoom, so she can correct me later in the chat. But we sort of never stopped once we saw musicals. And remember, they were much more affordable then. So, we kind of saw everything. And Sondheim was absolutely our favorite. And Robin and I literally knew every word to every musical ever. We were completely uncool nerds. Like, I did not know a pop song, but, ask me about Someone in the Tree from Pacific Overtures or A Weekend in the Country from Little Night Music. I mean, that's where we lived. And it was bottomless love. Like, we listened and listened and listened. I remember what every cover looked like. I would sit, on my Mary Mecco rug and just like listen to this stuff. It was dazzling, and I still remember the thrill when that curtain went up. And Sondheim was not necessarily huge box office always. There were, he was controversial in the complexity of his lyrics, and sometimes Pacific Overtures is sort of a bizarre plot choice for a musical. And as with Sweeney Todd, where you're suddenly like eating, cannibalism.
Even Company, where you're forcing adult audiences to sit through,
exactly.
A reverie about marriage that isn't necessarily glamorous, right?
Right, not at all. Like, everybody's marriage is falling apart, and you have a single person who doesn't have a happy ending. So, and so for some, to get to your point, my Sondheim history was deep and vast and passionate. And I'm not necessarily sort of proud of how narrow I was in my interests, but it really kind of oriented my hobbies, the things I spent time on.
And do you remember the first show that you heard of his?
I want to say it was Company, but I can't believe it was Company because that was 71. And I was, at that point, 6 or 7. It's possible. Maybe it was the first album. I certainly remember seeing Sweeney, multiple times. And as we will talk about, when I went to high school, I actually became friends with Daisy Prince, who was the daughter of Hal Prince, who directed all those things. And so instead of like, Daisy would say like, do you want to go out to a coffee shop? Do you want to, go make dinner, or should we go see Sweeney Todd. It was lucky enough that was just something she was able to do and brought along, her fellow Broadway obsessor. And so we would actually go see Evita together, and any possible Sondheim, either any Broadway show or anything that was happening, sort of offline in a reading or, a kind of a backers audition, whatever they were doing.
But your parents were the ones who sort of opened this world up to you in that sense? They shared your love of it? Or
they opened this world, but they were not theater people themselves.
Right.
My dad was more like, he played the guitar and sang kind of liberal lefty folk songs, like WPA songs,
Yep.
And labor movement ballads, and absolutely very talented. I think my dad's a great singer, and mom too. And they would harmonize, but it wasn't like they were the show babies at all. That was really, they very much supported our insanity until, I will say, Robin and I begged to get an agent and to start auditioning. And that's when I could feel some of their reticence of like, I'm not sure I want you to be show children. We're not going to be show parents, and you're going to get an education. A very kind of Jewish wariness about letting us take the full dive.
So this was when you went to audition for Merrily, or we'll talk about what that process was like, but this wasn't the first show you auditioned for.
No, we had auditioned for other things. Like we had been in some commercials. I don't know if anyone remembers Eric Estrada. Does anyone remember? He was on Chips.
I'm seeing nods.
Anyway, so Rob and I did this like I don't know if it was an infomercial or something, because we look exactly alike. So I would like hit myself and she would go, ow. It was brilliant, really brilliant content. But what we did do was, in terms of musical, is that we were lucky enough to audition for the summer stock, the first iteration of Annie. And that was at the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam, Connecticut, which, if anyone has ever been, is a jewel box of a theater. And it's where such amazing pieces are revived. And we were obsessed with Goodspeed. It was one of those places that was doing shows. We would go and visit and watch, for a week, the same show over and over again. And so we were lucky enough to get an audition for that. We made the mistake of auditioning together, which is something you shouldn't do. And
why?
They offered the part. Why? Because I think it confused them. We were sort of auditioning for one role as a pair. And they actually offered the role to one of us. They said, you have to basically pick who's going to do it. I think the role was for Happy. All the orphans had names. And so we declined. And what I don't remember is exactly how that conversation went. I think that my parents were beginning to sort of say, well, you'd have to go back to school anyway, so you wouldn't be able to stay with the show if it moved. The rest is history. And it became an enormous success. Andrea McCardle stepped into the role. She was in it when we were auditioning. I remember meeting her, but she was originally an orphan. She wasn't the original Annie. And we're not here to talk about Annie, but ultimately that went on where it did, and Robin and I did not go with it. So I'm sure some people think we've made it up at this point, but both of us were there, and we know it happened. Gosh darn it.
And was that a catalyst to kind of, for you to want to keep auditioning? You kind of the sense that,
I think that I definitely knew that I wanted to keep learning, and I did not want to necessarily, I had some sense already as a New Yorker that, education was of value and that theater was a little bit perilous as a career choice, but absolutely it's what I thought I was going to do. And so when this opportunity came, I was 15 years old, and they were auditioning kids from all over the city, all over the country. And I jumped at the chance.
So let's get into Merrily, because part of the incredible aspect of you being willing to share with us is, as all of us are in some ways kind of mourning the loss of Sondheim, you are somebody who was in an original Broadway show of his. You went through this experience. You went through, we called it kind of going behind the curtain. You were behind the curtain, and I think it'd be great to hear a little bit more from you about what that experience was like, what he was like during that experience. And this was a really pivotal show that, there's sort of the Hal Prince era, and then he'll be, his famous two volume work ends with this show, and then intermission, he calls it, because his last lines are, and then I met James Lapine, and it's sort of this kind of pivot point for him. Right. So how did you first get attached to the show? Right, there was this reading that you were involved.
Yeah. So they did like a test reading, which is something obviously that happens often with shows, and they basically cast it just to hear it. They want to hear the script, they want to hear some of the songs. That was thrilling, and I got the chance to do that. And basically because the casting director, again, this is one of those small Jewish worlds, I was at the Dalton School, she came to the Dalton School, she had seen some of the stuff I'd done there. And so I was one of the people who auditioned and was lucky enough to be put in this reading in a very small role, but we did it on the stage of Evita, which was running at the Winter Garden Theater. That's where Cats ran, if people remember where that is on Broadway. And the stage was raked for Evita, for anyone who remembers that show. So all of us were on chairs, and I remember being so nervous that I was gonna actually fall off the stage because it was on such a severe slant. And there in front of me, I mean, I was shaking, was Hal Prince, Stephen Sondheim, all of, Steve had a musical director, and Hal had a long time casting director, Joanna Merlin, and then a stage manager, and then and George Firth, obviously the writer, was there. So it was, out of body experience to be part of this. And to hear Steve Sondheim playing songs at the piano was surreal and incredible. And, some things worked, some things didn't. But to be part of it and to see that enough was working, that they were excited, I think we all knew after that afternoon that this was going to go forward in some form. We weren't sure when or how. And then they basically, next thing you knew, they were having auditions for the actual show. And that was honestly grueling, because thousands and thousands of young people, and most of us very green, which is what they wanted, but they also wanted people who could take a piece of music and learn it, take a piece of choreography and learn it. And bit by bit, I remember that day, it came down to the final callbacks, and people began being sort of not whittled away, but sort of counseled out, we would probably say today. They were disappearing, one group after another, and then just a few of us were left. That was like very much at the end of a very long day.
So within one day, you found out that you were going to be in this show, basically?
Yeah, basically, when I would say from the callbacks, I mean, my initial audition was probably not the same day, right, but the callback day was very, very long day. And my song, I think, was Singing in the Rain. So I had to keep coming in and singing it. Many of you can hear now that I've lost my voice. We can get into why, because it's sort of linked to Merrily. I used to have a belt, they would call it sort of like the Annie belt, where it was very much a chest voice. I mean, Ari knows what this is, or any of our cantors. So I really didn't have a very well-trained voice. It wasn't an operatic one. It was sort of a belt. And I was not among, I would say, the most trained or fluid singers. I was an enthusiastic kind of powerhouse singer at 15 years old, and that ship sailed very quickly. But the bottom line is, I think they had to make sure I could sing it well enough. I was one of the strongest dancers because I'd taken a lot of dance classes, but that is a very low bar. There were a lot of these kids who really couldn't dance at all. And so some of us who actually had even taken dance classes or been in dance recitals, that began to matter because there was choreography.
Yeah. And how did you choose Singing in the Rain?
I loved that song, and it was in my range enough that I felt like I could be comfortable. I could sing it again and again without the voice tiring too much. And it was a joyful song for me. So.
What's the etiquette? One doesn't do a Sondheim song for a Sondheim audition?
Oh God, no. I mean, one barely does Sondheim for Sondheim. I mean, you asked what he's like, and once I was blessed enough to be in the show, he never got less scary. I mean, when someone has this kind of, he's sort of a deity, you sort of think, well, he's going to come down to earth once I spend time around him. No, he kind of stayed a deity. I think, he was sort of remote and awkward a little bit socially. I don't think he had to be particularly garrulous or warm. I mean, but at the same time, there was great affection. Like there was, sort of a wink and a nod. His humor was very wry. You got a feel for him, but he was never going to be your buddy. Whereas like Hal Prince was absolutely a father figure for us all. Steve states, was scary, stayed scary. And there were a couple times where I would see with those with bigger roles where he would reprimand someone for quote unquote, you're not singing it the way I wrote it. And he would say, sing it the way I wrote it. No creativity, no invention invited at all. In fact, he really was unhappy if someone was improvising.
I'm going to invite folks, I should have said at the beginning, if you want to put questions you have for Abby in the chat, the wonderful Jake Stapanski is going to collect those, and we'll try to get to as many as we can as the evening goes on. So you find out your cast. There's an incredible documentary that we'll talk about a little bit later. But a lot of it in that documentary, they sort of refound this footage because there was a documentary, and I think I'm getting this right, a documentary crew from ABC that was shooting footage of this because they're, after this huge success that they'd been on, they wanted to kind of get a lot of footage to for a show that was kind of that would show people kind of behind the scenes of what this was like. Is that right?
Yeah, it was basically ABC News thought, like, understandably, this is going to be a hit. So we're going to watch it. It's kind of like watching a candidate, from the beginning of the campaign.
Right.
We're going to watch every bit of this, and then we'll have this extraordinary footage to do a documentary on the making of the next Hal Prince, Stephen Sondheim blockbuster. So they were there with us all through, and it was precious footage. And after we crashed and burned, which we'll talk about, it's like everything just shut down. And I don't know what happened to that footage. No one could find it, literally for 30 years. And then this documentary, which you're talking about, Best Worst Thing, which actually went to the New York Film Festival and was made by one of the leads in the show, Lonnie Price. He managed doggedly, finally, to find it. It's an extraordinary story how he did, and it's an hour by itself. But literally, these boxes were in a warehouse, and no one had touched them, and no one could find them. And suddenly, there it was, my incredibly ugly 15-year-old self in braces, completely over earnest, talking about my dreams. All of that footage was found, and not just me, all of us.
But one of the things that's captured in that is the moment when all of you find out that you're cast. He comes in. I imagine you all must have been nervous about another round or yet another, being through your paces. And he just says, "All of you who are here, you're in the show." And it's there's this eruption,
pandemonium.
It by all accounts was a very, very close cast that you were in.
Yeah, it was instant. I think, first of all, that day you sort of felt like, it's so ridiculous to say, it's like you're in the trenches, but as people, sort of the bodies were falling around us, you felt more and more bonded. And when Hal came in and said, "I have good news and bad news. The good news is you're all on the show."
That's right.
And we just lost our minds and screamed for 10 straight minutes and hugged and jumped into each other's arms. And by that point, theater people, you're like in love already. But then he said, the bad news is we're not going to start rehearsals for 9 months or a year. I can't remember exactly. So first he said, "Don't grow. We're asking you, please don't grow." And also go learn to sing and dance. I remember that. So, it was, so what we did as a cast over those next 9 months or a year was stay in touch. We had parties, we got together, we practiced, we, started a newsletter. It was like we became a family before we even went to 890 Studios and started rehearsing. So by the time we actually arrived for that first day, and I was almost a year old, so 16 years old. I think I was the youngest in the cast. I'm not sure if Jason Alexander was the oldest.
What's the spread there, just to give us a sense?
I think the oldest was 22. Jason Alexander, he was almost married, so he was like an old man to us. Giancarlo Esposito, some people have seen Breaking Bad. He played, who did he play? Plays a very scary guy. Somebody will help us. Giancarlo was in it, and he was on the older side. But basically, most of us were, 16, 17, 18, 19. Anyway, so I was still in school. I was basically back in school. I was in 10th grade. We went into 11th grade. And then once we started rehearsing, I took time off to do this. And then when the show again failed, I went back to school, went back to high school.
What was it like to be in school, having been announced to be in a cast of a Sondheim show in New York City?
It was crazy. Of course, you feel a little bit like, are people going to hate me? Because It sounds so,
you must have known people who also went out for the part in that show and didn't get it.
No, I think there's a couple people who really remember that, who say, I was a much better singer than Abby. Why did Abby get cast? But I will say that it was a very, Dalton, particularly at the time I went, was very pro arts. And so everybody was very supportive. And it wasn't like a complete coast. I had to keep up with work and took that seriously. But I missed a lot of classes. But again, really all told, We started rehearsing, I think, at a time when it was still the summer, and we opened in November and closed after 16 performances. We previewed a very long time. We previewed for weeks and weeks, but we only ran once we were open for 16 shows.
It was about a month of previews, which is
okay. Thanks.
Which is a lot.
A month of
Which is a
previews.
lot.
I'm old, so I forgot. But I was basically back in school after Thanksgiving. You know, we opened November 16th. I think I was back in school right after the holidays.
And what, and you know, I think you said that they're here, so maybe they could correct you if you're wrong, but what was it like in your family once this dream actually manifested and you were in a show? Was it?
I have very, very good, like Jewish cheerleaders for parents. They could not have been more excited. And my sister, who, you know, had loved this theater world too, but was completely supportive. My dad used to be the one to pick me up from the theater. You know, I was still a little bit young to come home by myself at 11 o'clock at night. And particularly since during previews, people were walking out of the show. And that was dispiriting, sort of like we would start with a full theater and end with half. I mean, it was kind of shocking just how blatantly people let us know that what was working and what wasn't. But Dad was there really for support, and he was always in the wings. The last song of this show, as you know, is Our Time, and we're all on stage for that. And he would be in the wings watching it night after night. Those were some precious times.
Any words from them when this experience was going through, or
you know, I feel like what they saw was that the lessons were coming fast and furious, and they heard all the details, but they didn't need to process it. It was kind of right in front of me.
Okay.
And you know, it's always good to talk about the run up because it was so thrilling, and even rehearsal was thrilling. But once it began to struggle in previews, and once we saw our heroes trying to figure it out and kind of not solving it, I think that what they saw me seeing was that your heroes can stumble, and that's part of what they had always worried about, just generally with this career for me, was there's going to be a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot of rejection. There's going to be a lot of highs and lows. And, you know, this could have been a time, in a way, if this had just succeeded, I'm not sure that my life would have been the same, because I would have trusted and believed that things could be easier than I saw that they really weren't. I mean, just because if it had been everything we all expected it to be, I think I would have just said, this is how it works. You know, you're lucky enough to get into this show, and then you get the next show and the next. I'm sure at some point I would have come down to earth, but I came down to earth so quickly, and also I think was so startled that I was kind of like, what do you mean they're not fixing this? Like, isn't this fixable? How can we actually be about to fail and then actually fail? How are they actually telling us the show, this is all over, after essentially 2 years of being part of this meteor? It just crashed down to earth kind of in a day.
Well, and they, in their reflections on the show, kind of talk about feeling like they believed that they had fixed it by the time the show opened. And
you mean Steve and Hal?
Yeah.
They kind of had. Yeah. I think that we all look, you know, some of the best songs went in last. I mean, that's what's so amazing. And it is kind of extraordinary to me that they kind of came up on opening night thinking that this was gone, that they had solved it. Because when I look back, and obviously now everyone's an armchair critic, but even Stephen Sondheim has written about why he thinks the show didn't work. You know, I still think the show doesn't work. I'll be very honest about it. And I would say it even to my merrily fellow, you know, sisters and brothers. I still feel like the script doesn't work. The score is unbelievable. And anyone who knows it, it's just one of Stephen Sondheim's best scores. I think people say it's one of the best overtures ever written. I don't think that's hyperbole. And, you know, Good Thing Going and Hey Old Friends, and obviously Not a Day Goes By. There's incredible music, but just the script and the way that it starts with so much sort of ugliness that I think in some ways is dated now. And you know, what's interesting is that Steve worked until his death on Company, the one that is still or just closed on Broadway. And he was always doing that. He was always revisiting and tinkering. And with every Merrily revival, he was there. He came in, nothing could change without him, but he also was very open to change. It's why he allowed the Spanish West Side Story to happen. He gave permission and leeway for things to be reinvented. And I think that was such an incredible quality of his. He didn't say, this is fixed, I don't want you to touch it. And I just wonder, you know, again, as Merrily gets tried again, if he would have opened it up one more time, if he had lived.
Yeah, he's had a incredible history of trying to massage this show. And you know, he says that he thinks he really did get it close to being what it ought to have been originally, though, you know, like you said, that maybe there are some things that still just don't quite work. And
I think they should bring my part back. Really.
Well, so let's talk. Okay, tell me. Let's talk about the rehearsals. What were the rehearsals like? What was that experience like?
Yeah. I mean,
you know, Hal, you said is a father figure. Steven's a little more aloof. Like, what's the dynamic? What's it like?
The dynamic is like we're all kind of on crack. Like we are all happy every day. Everything is thrilling. Paul Giuliani, who is an incredible music director and was at, you know, Steve's side pretty much for everything, including then in his James Lapine next chapter.
Yeah.
You know, Paul was one of those people who was like, either they looked like Santa Claus and was a man of very few words and very few gestures, but you wanted his approval as a musical director. And then we were dancing with Ron Field, who had choreographed Evita, and you know that, I mean, not Evita, I'm sorry, Cabaret, and then they switched to Larry Fuller because they fired Ron Field, and Larry Fuller had choreographed Evita, which is some of the best choreography. So heady, incredible. We're seeing sets as they bring in, and then I had 12 costume changes. I mean, I had this tiny part, and I was changing 12 times, and I had boas, and I had strappy sandals and sequin tops, and then when they trashed all the costumes, I suddenly was in a t-shirt. We all went to t-shirts because they felt like there were too many characters and it was too confusing. And they literally put our titles, our monikers on our sweatshirts. So it was like Charlie's wife and, you know, Frank's boss. I mean, it was all Frank's girlfriend. I mean, if that's going to tell you, talk about Peshat, right? It says we need to spell this out for the audience. They don't know who we all are. And then they began to strip away our roles. And, you know, I have great humility. I feel like I used to be a singer and then I was never the greatest singer. And I had these 2 lines that really killed it in the reading. It's why I think I got cast. It brought the house down. And those 2 lines were never funny again. They were never as funny again. You realize that sometimes there's theater magic and everything's working and everything's fresh. And I think, you know, I'm not saying that's why those lines were cut. Everybody's parts got cut, but you had to have a great humility and resilience to just come back every day and learn new stuff and see that, you know, the things that had sort of distinguished you were no longer there. I was more and more an ensemble player every day. I will say that we were also on stage though a lot. So it wasn't like we weren't part of things. In fact, I once missed an entrance, which was horrifying. And opening doors, I had to literally push on a typewriter and forgot.
In rehearsal or in a show?
No, on Broadway. Okay. And this is where I am just, you should cover your face. Paul Giuliani, musical director, is in the pit and he held up a sign, Abby Pogrebin, call your agent. Like, but that goes to show you that, you know, it was just, we were on, we were off, we were moving things around. And I was still dancing, you know, I think I still had dancing props, but little by little, there was just less that distinguished each of us. And the costumes were more and more minimal and the scenery was more and more minimal. And so every day there were changes, which was also extremely hard to keep up with. And the pressure of getting close to opening night was pretty intense.
It's obviously painful when your own part starts to, you know, dwindle, but is there anything that you just thought was brilliant that never saw the light of day outside of those previews that you wish, you know,
that was in the show?
Yeah.
That I did? No,
I guess either.
No, there's nothing that I did, but I will say there's a song that ultimately got cut. And I'm going to forget the name of it. It is essentially it's almost a riff on a song that does exist. And oh my God, I'll have to get it. But you know, Jim Walton, who replaced Frank, I didn't even mention that one of the leads got replaced, which was very traumatic.
Yeah.
Right before opening, he still sings it when he performs, and it's just that heartbreaking, beautiful song. But this is where they say, you know, that phrase, you have to kill your babies. There were babies that just had to get sort of slashed at the very last minute. What was added, which was incredible, was Charlie's song, Help Me, during the talk show.
Franklin Shepherd Inc., famous.
Franklin Shepherd Inc., which is one of the hardest patter songs ever. It's kind of like I'm Not Getting Married. And I think that went in just days before we opened.
I can't imagine being handed that and said, you know, you've got a couple days, good luck. I mean, that is a mile song.
Yeah, crazy.
What at what point is it, that the cast, that you all start to realize something isn't quite right? When
I
in
mean, I certainly think, sorry, Ari, did I cut you off?
no.
Yeah, I certainly feel like in those last days, first of all, the press, I didn't even mention,
No.
there was a kind of schadenfreude happening in the theater world where people were kind of like, we're gunning for these guys. They were mavericks of the theater and they had this huge run of success. And so we're kind of taking them down. There was people sort of like, we're going to actually show that you can't have an uninterrupted run of winners. And so the press was, and the gossip about it was pretty negative. And I think that we were all, that was beginning to trickle down. We were rehearsing at the same time as at Dreamgirls. Michael Bennett was rehearsing Dreamgirls. We were literally one floor away in the elevator with these incredibly gorgeous, leggy black dancers. And I just remember feeling a little bit of like, well, we're going to be the hit, it's too bad. And next thing you know, they were monster hit, won all the Tonys. They were incredible. What a great show that is. But the point is that they had good buzz. We had bad buzz. And we sort of felt a little bit like, kind of damn the torpedoes, we're going to show them. But I literally remember sitting there and feeling like, why do I feel like the energy in this theater? At that point, we were in the Alvin rehearsing every day, is kind of tense. And I remember seeing that Hal began to be a little more brittle and short-tempered, that there was more kind of quiet talking. It sort of felt like something's going on that some of us are not privy to, that is stressful. And then after we opened, we had our opening night. I had my ridiculous outfit with my black choker. Thanks, Mom, but that was like the loserest opening night outfit. When I look at the pictures, it was just like, what was I thinking? I think it was like this big, velvet choker from Macy's and this star. Just terrible.
Your star?
But anyway, the Times review came out, and that was, as a death knell.
Yeah.
And we when we would gathered again, you always gather on stage for like a pep talk before it starts. And I just remember feeling like Hal is giving us the pep talk, but I'm not sure of the truth behind it. And then pretty soon we knew we were closing and going to record the cast album, which we almost didn't. I think that there was a question about whether there would be a cast album, which is kind of amazing because it's a beloved album.
Did Sondheim ever give a pep talk, or is that always Hal Prince's role?
That's a very good question. I feel like he was a cheerleader in his quiet way by being present, and he never sort of abandoned ship. I will say that when I read Finishing the Hat, I think that's when his book about Marilyn, and also in the documentary, which I hope people see, it's off of Netflix now, but it's coming back. And when Lonnie interviewed him, I could not believe how honest he was about how painful this failure was. I kind of thought, it's Steve Sondheim and he's a giant and a legend, and this is a notch in his belt, and it was unfortunate, but look at how it's been resurrected, and everybody still loves Stephen Sondheim, and they sing those songs from early, and he's okay. But it really was indelible. I think that for both of them, and very particularly for Hal, because he felt like we were his kids, and that somehow he let the kids down, and his daughter was in it. Right. And he felt, I think, like I let her down. So it was much more personalized, I think, than a usual flop.
There's always been a lot of talk about the fact that they never did a show together again after that. Is that, gossipy stuff, or do you think this experience really soured a relationship? If you're willing to go and sort of speculate, I
think from what I know and from what I gleaned, and I don't know it for sure, and as a reporter, you're asking the right question, because I would never want to misrepresent the truth. I do think that it wasn't so much that they were in conflict, it was that they reminded each other. It was like too painful for each of them to be back together, reflecting this very hard experience. And they sort of needed a restart, a recharge. And I don't think that either blamed each other at all, but I think they had a sense that artistically they needed kind of, a little bit of a like Yom Kippur reset. The fact that Hal went and did Phantom, that is the thing he basically lived on for the rest of his life. It was such a, not a cash cow. That sounds disparaging. It was incredible and runs to this day. And Steve obviously did Sunday in the Park, but they stayed absolutely very close. And Steve was very close to Judy Prince, Hal's wife, and I know close to the family. And I don't know if they ever I'm sure they sat down and went over it all, but they really didn't collaborate again. They really didn't.
Maybe because you're a glutton for punishment, you did choose to revisit this period of your life in that documentary that people absolutely must see. Not just because they found this footage, but I think that some of that it is the basis for even a high holiday sermon I gave, the second
and a great one.
High holiday sermon I gave about going back and wondering about whether your younger self would be proud of you, but. You chose to revisit that. Was that any trepidation as when Lonnie Price came to you and said, "I'm going to do this"? Did you immediately say yes, or was there a "oh my God, no" kind of feeling?
There was an "oh my God, yes." And by the way, I love your sermon, so everyone should revisit that as well. This documentary really ended up being about Marilee and how it changed all of us, but more about any of us who've had kind of a sense. It's kind of like a reflection, frankly, of Marilee. It sounds very cheesy, but it's true. It's very much a mirror on what the show was, of that, we started with hopefulness and a sense of what was possible. And we're very clearly taught harsh lessons about, not that you shouldn't try and shouldn't hope, but that you have to understand how much can veer off course, and how, what resilience means, and whether you get back up or whether you actually change direction. And this documentary ended up being very much about how, how it changed us all. Where my hesitation was I know, and I really mean this, it's not false modesty, that I had a small role in a very big part of Sondheim history. And yes, I experienced it very personally, and I am someone who kept diaries because that's what I always did. But I didn't want in any way presume, when Lonnie approached me, to make it look like I was saying I was the star of the show, please listen to me. What he ended up doing was picking 4 or 5 of us to follow, where did they land and how did this affect them and what are the lessons that they take with them. And I was very privileged that I was one of them. But when he was interviewing us, he was interviewing all of us, and I didn't know it would end that way.
Right.
And so I feel a little embarrassed about the screen time, honestly. But I also feel like what he captured is precious in terms of just all of the ways in which this never left us. For any of us, this was a seismic and seminal experience.
So, I think a lot of people could meet you and not know at all that you had this experience, but you also describe it as being seminal. So what you choose not to continue in the theater eventually. You stop auditioning. You have an incredible career in journalism.
Thank you.
So, what is it that you do take away from this show? What is, other than it being this incredible moment? But what do you walk away with?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that sense, and I think also the times have changed in terms of all of the kind of startup mentality and successes of much younger people with much less track record now can suddenly change the world. And that really wasn't my childhood, and it even wasn't my college life or my 20s life. It was much more A to B to C. And theater was this thing that was, if you can get magic in a bottle. But I was very clear on talent is not always going to be the thing that takes you to the next stage, and that the vagaries of whether someone likes you or doesn't, whether you get a part or not, that was already real to me. But it was brought home much more starkly watching many of my compatriots essentially now start at ground zero again. I went back to high school and the books and my test papers and frankly to high school theater, which I was happy to audition for again. And I still wanted to go back to my old life. But for those who had to start all over, it was so, it sounds so basic, but it's something you don't necessarily see at 16 years old, of you really can go back to square one. Whereas I would see in other ways, even in school, or for those who go to graduate school or start any job, if you do well at it, you're going to get the promotion, and then you're going to get the next job. And then eventually maybe you're running the company, or you're the one who people are listening to. It's not like that in theater for the most part. it's kind of ground square one, I would say, every time. And that was a huge, huge takeaway. And then again, watching what did happen with Steve and Hal, what did happen in terms of just heroes who you just have to have a kind of resilience and sureness of your own faith and belief in your talent and your ideas that I wasn't sure I had. It's like as a referendum on my own fortitude, I think I was shaky.
Can I ask you about attention? I've heard in some of your reflections on the show. I think in the book you wrote, Showstoppers, you said, if there's anything I hope my children glean from Merrily and from my Merrily adventure, it's to leap early and fully before there's too much at stake. But in in an interview you gave with Lonnie Price, I think you said that I wouldn't want my children to take their dreams too far, as one of the learning you also take from this. I'm wondering, those kind of,
you did your research.
Well, they stand a little bit in counterpoint with one another, and they were written at different times. But I'm wondering.
Yeah. I think I got more cautious, the older I became, and I feel like that happens. I mean, we all see that. It's a little bit sad to me to hear that. I forgot about that. I had said that. I still want my children to leap, absolutely, but I sort of like want them to leap with realism. That whole idea of following your bliss and at the same time, planning for the future in some way. And just, theater was just there was very little you could plan. And I think that scared me more the older I got. And I love journalism, and I loved writing. So it's not like I feel like I gave up my only love. But there was once an actor who said to me, if you can imagine yourself doing anything else, do it. Because you have to wake up every day feeling like acting is the only thing I can imagine doing, if you're going to sustain what it takes.
If I recall, that's an actor who knew what he was talking about, having been in the world a little bit. I think it was Alan Alda.
Yeah.
Good advice, I imagine.
Good advice. Yes. And I will say the only way I know him, because it sounds name droppy, is my mother was one of the co-founders or creators. She was on the editorial advisory group for Freeview You and Me, and Alan was very involved in creating Freeview You and Me. So he was in my life when I was much younger, and I remember just being lucky enough to once ask him, and he was very blunt.
It's not name droppy if the interviewer asks.
Good, you're right. I didn't mention him.
Can I ask kind of some maybe sort of lighter questions?
Sure.
Other than Merrily, what's your favorite Sondheim show?
Oh God, so hard. Oh, I mean, I love Sweeney Todd. I feel like that's almost the perfect show. There's so many shows I love the music, but sometimes like Follies, it just ends up being a bit of a slog. I love the new Lapine. My gosh, help me. Sunday in the Park.
Oh yeah.
No, is it Sunday in the Park? No.
When you say the new,
what is running now with Sarah Bareilles?
Oh, Into the Woods.
Into the Woods. But again, until this production, I didn't love it. Now I do. I always loved A Little Night Music, always. And yeah, I mean, and then Pacific Overtures. I mean, like my sister and I literally cried when it didn't win the Tony and Chorus Line won over it. Now I sort of think, well, what were we thinking? It's so clear that a Chorus Line is the more accessible show. But Pacific Overtures is just some of my favorite songs ever. I don't even think I understand the plot to this day, but I love that show. I
know that there are people who are with us right now who agree with you 100% and who feel like that show is an unsung hero in his relationship.
Very much.
You half jokingly talk about like a Sondheim Club, people who've been in his shows. Is there really a Sondheim Club? Like you see all these tributes and like, birthday anniversaries. Like, is there like a, time when people who are in Sondheim shows get together and talk about the experience?
I would say it's not like there's all, but our cast has stayed very bonded, and we're on Zoom during the pandemic and we show up for each other's stuff. And there's sort of there's still a very robust email list, which is pretty amazing. But in terms of people who've been in I would say when they had the 90th, which was during the pandemic and it had to go online, it's more just that there are so many Sondheimophiles, better what they're called. But all of us show up for anything, and I remember I was at the Avery Fisher Hall when I did his 80th, which is you can watch on YouTube. Everybody should watch the last Sunny in the Park with George finale when they brought out the chorus in the aisles, my sister and I just sobbing. It's kind of like if anybody who could possibly get a ticket, either like literally or metaphorically, would show up for any Sondheim tribute. And there were many. I'm so glad in his lifetime that he saw all those. And I was lucky enough to interview him for my book on famous Jews back in 2005. And that was just such a pleasure to do. And then my sister writes for the Times and used to cover theater. She doesn't now anymore, but she covers the arts. She covers fine art. But when she interviewed him, he would remember me, obviously looking at her, the same face. And there was something very touching about that he kind of remembered all of us when we would see him at things. But it's not like he was my buddy. I didn't stay in touch otherwise.
Where were you when you learned that he died?
I remember it was Thanksgiving weekend and I was cooking. And it was.
How did you find out?
On a alert on my phone.
And is that a moment when your cast was there for one another, or was there an impulse to reach out?
There was absolutely an impulse to reach out, and then we were also careful because Daisy, who's in the cast and who really, really was close to him, no one wanted to presume. This can happen when someone dies. I think in a good way, and not is that sort of like we all want a piece, and we're all posting our pictures with Steve, and all of that's wonderful. And what came out is how many letters he wrote, because I treasured the couple letters he wrote me when I wrote my Kindle single about the experience. Out of the blue, he wrote me a letter, which is framed, but I realized like he did that for a lot of people. He was a mentor, and that was his, to take the time on his typewriter to do that was extraordinary. So yeah, it was a time we all reached out, but I don't think we got together. No.
Some questions that have come in. As busy as you are, somebody's curious to know, if the right part came along, would you go back into the theater now?
No, that's so nice. No, absolutely not. I feel like, there is, like, as you know, in Ecclesiastes, a time for every purpose, every season, and that season has passed. Although, as some of asked me to write a birthday toast, some made up lyrics to Sondheim or any Broadway song, and I will do it pretty much on a dime. I take great pleasure in that, but no, and I really can't sing anymore. And I often ask my sister to sing for me because I really can't.
Another question is, what advice would you give to a young person right now based on your experience in Merrily?
It's really hard because I think what the pandemic has shown, on top of all the challenges already, is that this is a career that can stop, that literally can be suspended. And it also, once it restarted, was the most glorious return. I think for all of us, felt so moved by any of the firsts back. But I think it was pretty terrifying to be an actor. I know it was for anyone I know who just suddenly had it all dry up, and that's their income. These people are parents, they have kids. It's not like you're just the 25-year-old anymore. You're the 45-year-old who needs to pay the bills and was hoping to save for college. And that was a very stark thing to watch. And all of the things, the creative things that happened online and Zoom and performances were amazing, but they were not paying the bill.
Yes.
So that's not to say to discourage people, but I do think it has to be, first of all, the thing you live and breathe. And also, I think your ears do need to be open for whether the right people tell you you've got a shot at this. Don't just listen to the people you want to believe. But when I hear someone say, you know what, I do think that I can do the acting thing. I know I'm not the singer, but I could sing if I had to. Like, just getting realistic mentors who are going to tell you what they think is possible. Not that you should believe the naysayers, but if enough people are kind of not telling you they think it's possible, I would pay attention.
A question I like to ask everyone I talk to Sondheim about is if you would share your favorite lyric, whether it's from Merrily or any other show.
Yeah, I think it really is from Merrily, and it's in our time, years from now, we'll remember and we'll look back by the rooftop and hang a plaque. This is where we began. being what we can.
Well, and so why that lyric?
Ugh, so stupid. I get choked up. I feel like I remember being on that scaffolding and looking out and feeling like it was all ahead of us. And it was all ahead of me, like just life and opportunity. And I have been so lucky and so blessed. And there is nothing, even with the hurdles that I've had at different times, which we won't go into, nothing. I feel like the road was the road for a reason. But just, you don't know at that moment how much is open and uncharted and free. And that's just an incredible sweetness that I think you kind of never get back. And that lyric says that to me. So,
that's he said so much. He wanted to try to recapture his own sense of idealism and him at that age. So it sounds like, for you anyway, that lyric does bring you back to where he wanted his audience and actors to go. What a gift. I think all of us are beyond grateful that you have had many roads and chapters, and how lucky we've been to have had your leadership at our synagogue in so many ways, big and small. So
thank you.
we are just beyond grateful that you were willing to share a little bit more about this chapter with us.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh
I hope I didn't, embarrass myself. There was definitely a danger.
No. I have like 100 more questions. So at one point, we can have this conversation less publicly, maybe. But I'm so glad for so many of you who came and were joining us. I want to send it back to the incredible Jake Stapanski with our incredible gratitude for putting the summer of Sondheim together. And he's going to help us close out the night. But again, Abby, a huge thanks from all of us.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Jake.
Hey, I just want to say a huge thank you to Abby and Ari, and I want to share my favorite Sondheim lyric, because why not? It's a line from Into the Woods in the song Moments in the Woods, and the line is, "Oh, if life were made of moments, even now and then a bad one, but if life were only moments, then you'd never know you had one." And I think the genius of this line is that the word one at the end of this lyric can be interpreted as either a life or a moment. And I think it's really has been a real honor and pleasure to hear you speak about this moment in your life. And I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
The end. You're all wonderful. Have an incredible summer. I will see you soon at a virtual or in-person program real soon. Lots of
Bye, everybody.
gratitude to all. Bye.